It gives me pleasure to introduce this session on the status of interpretation. What is the game we're at anyway in terms of history of psychology and interpreting works that in a sense are also interpreting other works? This panel is put together by 3 former students of mine. And I'm reminded of a statement by Allen Ginsberg, citing some Buddhist, I don't know which Buddhist, but it's by Ginsberg, saying, basically, if your students don't surpass you, you're not much of a teacher. And I think this is exemplified by the papers in this session. The travel gods are not with us today due to plane cancellations and train cancellations. So the presentations will be part in person, part hybrid. So we begin with Gaia Domenici, who's beaming in for us from Pisa. What a shame she's in Pisa. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you.
Can you hear?
I can hear, sorry, I'm just gonna share the screen now.
Can you hear? Okay, good.
Okay, can everyone see the screen and read? Okay, great. I shall get started. So in years 1934-1939, Jung held a 5-year seminar at the Psychological Club in Zurich, entirely dedicated to the interpretation of Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Even though the seminar was mostly in English, that occasion also marked Jung's 3rd official reading of the book. The first one taking place in his student years, the second one during the First World War, only a few months before the first fantasies that will later become known as the Red Book. And indeed, Jung's second reading of Nietzsche's Zarathustra represented his first reaction to the fear of madness that the outbreak of unexpected fantasies had given him. Assuming that both Nietzsche and he had experienced similar encounter with the so-called unconscious, Jung was hoping to demonstrate how Nietzsche's rejection of Christianity couldn't save him from his madness, and consequently, how embracing a new dimension of Christianity could potentially be his only way to avoid the same tragic fate. If one compares Jung's earlier writings with those written after 1916, a shift in his understanding of Nietzsche is obvious. Whereas Nietzsche was regarded as both an inspired poet and a precursor of some of his theories in Jung's early works, he then became Jung's favorite example of failed individuation. The common ground to explain this shift is found in Jung's very own experience with the unconscious. Nietzsche's Zarathustra was comparable to Jung's Liber Novus, both being examples of visionary works, according to the definition that he provides in 1930. With this in mind, Jung's later interpretation of Nietzsche can be best explained and contextualized through both implicit and explicit references occurring in Liber Novus, as well as with the marginalia that Jung wrote in his own copies of Zarathustra, both the German and the English ones, which are kept at his personal library in Q. So the aim of today's presentation is to unpack Jung's understanding of Nietzsche's Anima in his 1934-1939 seminar, keeping in mind all this contextualization. So let's start from Jung's understanding of Nietzsche's Anima in Zarathustra. Considering Zarathustra as a visionary work, Jung automatically assumes that it also reflects Nietzsche's experiences with the unconscious. While this interpretation is highly questionable and of scarce philosophical relevance, it is crucial to comprehend Jung's understanding of Nietzsche's Anima. Such an understanding emerges quite clearly from Jung's interpretation of the following chapters, the night song, the dance song, the grave song, and the stillest hour. Such chapters are implicitly and explicitly cross-referred to two other chapters, which he never managed to interpret in the seminar, possibly due to the outbreak of the Second World War, which interrupted the seminar. And these chapters are the second dance song and Amongst the Daughters of the Desert. According to Jung, Nietzsche's I is completely inflated with the spirit archetype emerging through the old wise man that the character of Zarathustra represents. As a consequence, Nietzsche comes across as unable to acknowledge, accept, and integrate the anima that appears to be either grotesquely impersonated by Zarathustra himself, for example, through his passion for dancing and singing, or projected onto a form of immature eroticism, that's what Jung calls it, such as the plurality of maidens dancing next to the well depicted in the dance song. Such inability to integrate the anima would derive, in Jung's opinion, from Nietzsche's strict Lutheran morality, inherited by the matriarchal family he grew up with, and possibly his father, who was a pastor. Here is how Jung describes Nietzsche's immature relationship with the anima in the seminar. A multiplicity of anima figures is only to be met with in cases where the individual is utterly unconscious of his anima. In a man who is completely identical with the anima, you might find that plurality, at the moment he becomes conscious of that figure, she assumes a personality and is definitely one. This is in contradistinction to the animus in women, who, as soon as she becomes conscious of him, is definitely disseverable. So, from such a symbol, you can conclude that Nietzsche's Zarathustra is profoundly unconscious of his anima. Yet, we cannot assume, inasmuch as Zarathustra is a typical wise old man, that he would be unconscious of the nature of the anima. And then he goes on with an analogy from Faust to explain, in one measure, the old wise man can make one aware of the anima. In an utterly similar way, Jung also interprets the flock of doves surrounding the laughing lion on the Old and New tables. The lion of Salon, the bell-hum in the drawing room with a flock of young girls around him. And then there is a rooster and the hens. That is a very covert metaphor for somebody whose audience contains a greater number of ladies. And then Jung says, so the laughing lion is obviously himself with an audience, and the doves are specifically feminine birds, which he defines as lovebirds, for they represent the birth of the bird of Aphrodite. And then he continues explaining how the birds also represent the Holy Ghost, and enriches his interpretation with references from both Gnosticism and alchemy. This is important to note because, according to Jung, Nietzsche does intuit the higher and sacred meaning of the anima, both at a collective level and in relation to his own individuation process. However, because his relation to the anima is so undeveloped, the erotic aspect of the anima surpasses the sacrality of her value. This situation appears to Jung as generated by Nietzsche's incapacity to face his own solitude, which would lead him to get lost within his unconscious projections. This reminds one of what Jung said about himself and his experience with these fantasies at the beginning of Liber Novus. In particular, it is the question of the desert that seems to arise. Is it solitude to be with oneself? Solitude is true only when the self is a desert. Which means that as long as one's inner demons are perceived as external dangers, and thus rejected, solitude will always be confused with loneliness. However, when one faces the shadow, the desert turns into a garden, and being with oneself no longer means being lonely. According to Jung's interpretation, the plot of Zarathustra reflects Nietzsche's failed individuation, because it begins with the height and pureness of the mountain where Zarathustra has lived for the past decade, and ends with the Dionysian orgy, so Jung calls it, represented by the pagan rituals, alcohol abuses, and more explicit eroticism in the last chapters of the last book. And such a twist also reflects Nietzsche's enantiodromia, a direct consequence of his failed individuation. From an introverted, intuitive poet, Nietzsche becomes prey of uncontrollable extroverted sensation, embodied by his latest poetry, the posthumously published Dionysus Didymus. The aforementioned more explicit eroticism is well represented by the chapter Amongst the Daughters of the Desert, which Jung did not officially interpret in the seminar, but whose marginalia help us figure out what an interpretation would be like. In Jung's own Zarathustra exemplar in German are important marginalia, underlinings, and markings. In particular, near the lines, roar once again, roar morality, roar like a moral lion before the daughters of the desert, a meaningful inscription reads, morals has devoured the other leg. Die Moral hat das andere Bein gefressen. These lines are entirely underlined and supported by a vertical mark along the text in Jung's own copy. And moreover, just 2 stanzas above, the phrase angry blonde-maned lion master is underlined and displays a pencil inscription which most likely means see below, where Jung probably refers to the aforementioned passage and his own comment. Jung's understanding of Nietzsche's symbol of the lion in its relation to the desert follows a parallel evolution to Jung's own understanding of Nietzsche. For this reason, this image can be considered one of the key symbols to understand Jung's confrontation with Nietzsche and his interpretation of the anima. In fact, if compared with the English version used by Jung during the seminar, the same preoccupation concerning the relation between the girl's leg, the lion, and Nietzsche's morality emerges quite clearly, although Jung has never been able to interpret Amongst the Daughters of the Desert in the seminar, as we said. But if we look at the copy he had in his library, the sentence, "Oh, pity for that loveless other leg," is underlined, and getting back to the German text, this and the previous lines, "She has lost it, it has gone down forever, that other leg," are accompanied by a vertical sign, and the sentence, "Sie hast es verloren," is even underlined. So, once again, Nietzsche's interiorized morality, represented by the lion, prevents him from integrating the anima in a healthy way, so the anima gets projected onto another plurality of exotic dancing girls, protagonists of a song arisen from alcohol and old memories. And past this point, Nietzsche's relationship with the anima is impossible to recover, and the beginning of the end officially starts, according to Jung. As I mentioned at the beginning, Jung decides to read Zarathustra for the second time in winter 1914-1915. What I didn't mention is that one of the main reasons for his second reading is Jung's own experience with the unconscious. Although implicit references to Nietzsche and Zarathustra are recurring throughout both layers of Liber Novus, fantasies and comments, in January 1914, Nietzsche makes his first official explicit appearance in Liber Novus, and from September 1915 onwards, Nietzsche becomes one of the main targets of the conversations between Jung's I and Philemon, although his presence often remains implicit. Shortly after Nietzsche's first appearance in Jung's fantasies, Jung decides to read Zarathustra again. Why? Well, in the series of fantasies where Nietzsche appears explicitly, the main topic is the possible link between the imitatio Christi and madness. More specifically, how imitating the life of Christ instead of becoming Christ oneself can lead to madness. However, Nietzsche's two oppositional ideas seem to equally lead to madness. As Jung's I explains, like everything healthy and long-lasting, truth unfortunately adheres more to the middle way, which we unjustly abhor. And indeed, 2 fantasies later, Jung's I wakes up in an asylum next to a patient who believes to be Nietzsche. And we have a date for this. This happened on 18th January 1915. What Jung comes to realize is that traditional Christianity has failed in that it has rejected divine folly, the most human aspect of human nature. One could perhaps say the shadow, using Jung's formal vocabulary. However, also the complete rejection of Christianity has failed, as it has led humans to give up an equally important part of their nature. In this sense, Nietzsche's failed individuation and consequent madness become the most striking examples of the negative consequence of a full rejection of Christianity. Even more than this, however, Nietzsche also becomes Jung's #1 opponent and comparison, because they both experience similar encounters with the unconscious, in Jung's opinion. While Nietzsche failed because he rejected Christianity, Jung becomes more and more sure about the importance of integrating a sort of original Christianity to save himself from the possibility of ending up like Nietzsche. And this thought is also made clear by a passage reported in Memory Sprint's reflection. My family and my profession remained the base to which I could always return, assuring me that I was an actually existing, ordinary person. The unconscious contents could have driven me out of my wits, but my family and the knowledge I have a medical diploma from a Swiss university, I must have my patients, I have a wife and 5 children, I live at 228 Strasse in Küsnacht. These were actualities which made demands upon me and proved to me again and again that I really existed, and that I was not a blank page wailing about in the winds of the spirit, like Nietzsche. Nietzsche had lost the ground under his feet because he possessed nothing more than the inner world of his thoughts, which incidentally possessed him more than he is. He was uprooted and hovered above the earth, and therefore he succumbed to the exaggeration and the reality. For me, such a reality was the quintessence of our world, for I aimed, after all, at this world and this life. No matter how deeply absorbed or how blown about I was, I always knew that everything I was experiencing was ultimately directed at this real life of mine. I meant to meet its obligations and fulfill its meanings. My watchword was, hic produs, hic salta. So, to conclude, even though Plato, Kant, and Schopenhauer are arguably most influential to Jung's philosophy, the man Nietzsche has arguably played a central role in the development of analytical psychology. Indeed, not much as a philosopher or a philologist, but as a man, has Nietzsche been a constant source of confrontation throughout Jung's life. Such a confrontation concerns first and foremost Jung's own fear of madness, as well as the development of a new form of Christianity to protect himself from such fear. As we saw earlier, Jung understands and interprets Zarathustra as a visionary work, just like he interprets his own Liber Novus. By so doing, he pays a great deal of attention to details that are almost irrelevant to a philosophical interpretation of Zarathustra, but are essential to an analytical psychological interpretation of Nietzsche's personality. For example, the doves or other animals that we didn't have the time to cover, such as the frog or the serpent. Thanks to implicit and explicit references from Liber Novus, and thanks to the marginalia present in Jung's copies of Nietzsche's work, Such analytical psychological interpretation of Nietzsche's personality can be better contextualized and integrated. Whereas Jung's understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy lacks of accuracy, his interpretation of Zarathustra as a manifestation of Nietzsche's encounter with the unconscious can definitely enrich the interpretation of a book that Nietzsche declared to be for all and none, and that encourages a plurality of interpretative dimensions and possibilities in its battle against rigid truths and dogmas. Therefore, whilst it is important to understand how Jung's interpretation evolved over the years through historical philological add-ons, we should not let such historical philological add-ons take over and diminish the importance that an analytical psychological reading of Zarathustra has acquired in both Jung and Nietzsche scholarships. On the contrary, a historical philological analysis of Jung's interpretation of Nietzsche lays bare Jung's innermost doubts and struggles and brings him closer to us in his most human nature. Thank you.
Questions and comments?
I have a question, Gaia.
Go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit more about that difference between explicit and implicit references to Nietzsche? What does the implicit references, what do they look like, as opposed to the explicit ones?
Yeah, okay, all right. So mostly by implicit references, I mean those allusions that recur in layer 2, typically, so comments, or like retrospective comments, and re-elaborations. So you find most of them in Liber Primus. And if you I don't know if you ever read my thesis or my book, but I can send you a PDF. So you'll find that most of those references are actually referring to traditional themes of Christian and the post-Kreuzer mythology. So there's an abundance of references to myths and so classic elements which recur in all visionary works. It's like something that's very typical. But some of these references are re-elaborated in a way that reminds us of Nietzsche. And these reminders are all confirmed by looking at the annotations that Jung wrote in his own copies of Zarathustra. The most striking example is there's a chapter of Zarathustra, and you would never think about it, but there's a cross-reference to Jung's own incantation from Liber Novus. So you would never think that chapter refers to the incantation of the eggs, the incantations of the egg, but in his mind it did, because that's what he wrote on top of the chapter. So then you go back and see, how that chapter in Liber Novus, is written, and you'll find that there are actually a couple of allusions that, remind one of the of Zarathustra, and on the symbology used by Jung in Zarathustra. And some, like the most important elements, concern the desert, the lion, and the Eastern symbology, like, for example, the sunset, the figure of the priest or the young bride, and who seeks wisdom, and who lives, in harmony with the sun path. And basically, as I said, these are mostly So these are themes and symbols that recur in all visionary works, but the way Jung deals with them, you know, the specific image he chooses to use only belongs to Nietzsche. And I know that because I read, you know, all the main visionary works that he used. And I found other allusions to works from Spiegler or Fischer, for example, but like, you know, there's a specific trend that can only be referred to Zarathustra. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Could you say more about the point you made at the end and the manner in which Jung's interpretation, not of Zarathustra, but his interpretation of Nietzsche's experience, can open avenues in Nietzsche scholarship?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit reductive to just condemn Nietzsche's interpretation, Jung's philosophical interpretation of nature, and to just, you know, dismiss it as inaccurate. I was guilty of it myself the first time I wrote a Jung's seminar on Zarathustra. It was a huge disappointment to me. But then, actually, when you think about the plurality of perspectives that Zarathustra intends to be read in, you'll find that, I mean, it is a product of Nietzsche's experience anyway, and it can be considered, you know, a product of Nietzsche's possibly, I mean, experience with the unconscious at some level. So there's nothing wrong with interpreting Zarathustra as of Nietzsche's mind. And so in this sense, it might also help us understand Nietzsche from a, well, not philosophical perspective, but from a psychological perspective, even in the philosophical scholarship, even in the purest philosophical context of our, you know, Nietzsche readings. And at the same time, when one thinks of the visionary works as a tradition, I think it's a new perspective that probably nobody before Jung had thought of interpreting Zarathustra in. So it can actually, you know, open up a new and a further, you know, interpretative dimension. And the same goes with Jung, because after Liber Novus, we know that now Jung's whole depth psychology needs, you know, being rethought and reconsidered in relation to these visionary works, which most arguably, which most likely it belongs to, according to Jung.
Great, thanks. And as Gaia alluded to, just humbly in passing, she's written a major book on Jung's reading of Zarathustra, Liber Novus, and Visionary Works by Palgrave Macmillan, still available to order. And it's a great read. It's a cool book. So thank you. From Zarathustra, we move to Eros. And we now move from 2 to 3 dimensions with Tommaso. That's fine. To share screen.
Yeah. There you go.
You need to share screen so we can see them. Go back to the Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oops. There, that one. Share screen. Yeah.
Gaia, can you see my screen now? Okay, brilliant. Can you hear me if I speak without the mic? Or hello? You prefer the mic?
I can't hear you, Tommaso, if you speak like that.
Okay, how about now? Okay. So when it comes to Jung and sex, a number of myths and misconceptions arise.
The most common ones being the general assumption that Jung, compared to Freud, downplayed the meaning of sexuality, and the persistent gossiping around Jung's personal life, and particularly his relationships with women. Furthermore, psychoanalytic literature remains generally cold to Jung's contribution to sexuality, but Jungian literature too, possibly to a greater surprise, has a tendency to dismiss Eros when talking about Jung, displacing sex in the realm.
No.
It's okay. Hello.
I must speak, please. I need.
Hello.
Yeah, there's one here.
Hi, David.
Yeah. Just carry on. Carry on.
Yeah. Okay. So, I was saying that psychoanalytic literature is generally cold to Jung's contribution to sexuality, but Jungian literature too shows a tendency to dismiss Eros when talking about Jung, displacing sex in the realm of spirit or archetypes. I think that another story awaits to be told. Jung did give an enormous importance to sexuality, and it is an interpretation that still needs to be explored. Eros is present along the entire span of Jung's works, and not only in the early phase of his engagement with psychoanalysis. It evolves substantially in the course of time from a focus on sexuality to the idea of cosmogonic Eros. Eros played a crucial part in what Jung identified as the most important and most difficult experiment of his life, the Red Book, Liber Novus, at both biographical and symbolical levels. Biographically, because of the fundamental role that a few women had in Jung's life during the time of his experiment, particularly Toni Wolff, who was Jung's lover and soulmate at the time, and Emma Jung, his wife. Symbolically, through some of the most important characters one finds in the Red Book. For example, Salome, the bloodthirsty daughter of Eros, who appears to Jung's eye, the narrator of the Red Book, and initiates him into the mysteries of pleasure and love. And Phanes, the primordial god of light in Orphic theology, also known as Eros, who appears in the Red Book as a central figure in Jung's visions. However, the topic of Eros and the Red Book would require a separate talk. Let me just single out an important quote. This is Phanes in Jung's Red Book. The world of the gods is made manifest in spirituality and sexuality. This quote, although in the characteristic language of the Red Book, encapsulates the development of the theme of Eros in Jung's works. Let us keep it in mind. In a lecture on psychoanalysis in Zurich in July 1912, Jung pointed out the following. It is a surprise and a shock to people that the analysts overestimate the importance of sexuality. It is very rare to find a neurotic case where a sexual disturbance is not the root of the trouble. A few months later, in his New York lectures, he began to formulate his critique of psychoanalytic sex theory. This was the same period when Transformation Symbols of the Libido was published, so the work that marked his distance from Freud's purely sexual conception of the libido. Historically, Jung's critique of the Freudian view of sexuality claimed that it was reductionist, so one-sided, adultomorphic, when adult traits are ascribed to children, and causalistic, when everything is explained as a result of a previous case. Nevertheless, in 1912, in New Paths in Psychology, Jung maintained that the true root of the neurosis resided in a hidden erotic conflict. He stressed that the causes of neurosis should not be found in the past, but in the present, as the result of two erotic tendencies in conflict. As Shamdasani outlined, neurosis was at this point seen by Jung essentially in terms of self-division, the result of the conflict between nature and culture. In this scenario, the sexual question had to be taken very seriously, at least for those men and women who would be willing, in Jung's words, to throw off, to challenge the existing sexual morality and seek to throw off the burden of moral guilt which past centuries have heaped upon Eros. With this provoking statement, he certainly counted himself among these men and women. Whilst identifying the goal of throwing off the burden of moral guilt, one of the main tasks of analysis. In a certain agreement with Nietzsche, he observed that the problem of sexual morality became increasingly acute due to two colluding factors, Christianity and industrialization. One could say a qualitative and a quantitative problem around sex. Jung claimed that the development of industrialization left city dwellers with surplus energy due to the lack of outlets for venting affective energies. By contrast with the peasant's life, city workers became completely removed from instinctual life. Reckless sports, alcohol and drugs, the rush of money-making, the performance of duties, workaholism, these were in Jung's view only a few of the many examples of modern man's unsuccessful attempts to make some use of their surplus energy. This situation, according to Jung, was further complicated by the legacy of Christian morality. Jung expressed this view nowhere more precisely than in 1923 in the yet unpublished Polzet seminar. In this context, he identified four major psychological exclusions caused by Christianity: sexuality, animality, the inferior man, and creative imagination. The repression of the drives meant that when they resurfaced, they did so in an unregulated manner, at times completely destructive, like in the case of wars. So the less integrated the animal was in men, the more animal-like they became. Therefore, Jung noted that it was essential for humans to be connected with their animal side. He emphasized the importance of animal symbolism in dreams and stressed the need of overcoming our personal fears with regard to animals. He sustained that the collective unconscious contained not only the residues of human evolution, but also of animal evolution. Therefore, coming to terms with the animal in us would be seen as a fundamental step for psychological health. However, that a critical task of analysis was that of becoming more animal instead of more civilized could be easily subjected to misunderstandings. So Jung clarified his positions in this way. Only man is extravagant. Many years later, James Hillman took up Jung's perspective on the instincts with regard to the example of pornography. Hillman regarded the billion-dollar industry of pornography as one of the most significant contemporary symptoms of what Jung described as the rebellion of nature over civilization. Following the break from Freud and in the middle of his visionary experiment, Jung continued to develop his model of Eros. The idea of a reconciliation between sex and spirit became prominent. In 1917, in the Psychology of the Unconscious Processes, he referred to Eros as a superhuman power. In Jung's words, Eros only thrives when spirit and instinct are in the right harmony. He called Eros a questionable fellow that will always remain so, whatever the legislation of the future may have to say about it. In 1918, in The Role of the Unconscious, he suggested Eros would be a better word to describe what Freud referred to as sex. And a few years later, in December 1922, he gave a talk at the Zurich University in front of an audience of students. This talk was published in 1928 with the title The Love Problem of a Student. In this talk, he identified a new sexual question for contemporary times, drawing on the title of Auguste Forel's famous book. Jung's version of the sexual question was that psychoanalysis brought to the fore the tremendous psychological importance of sex. He called it a symptom of the great psychological revolution of our time, which the more seriously and thoroughly is discussed, the better it will be for all of us. A few years later, in 1925, he gave a seminar in Zurich. Speaking to his audience, he remarked that when Freud talked of sexuality, it was as though he were talking of God, as a man would talk who had undergone a conversion. Freud, in Jung's view, was a case of compensation. For all of his repudiation of spirituality, he ended up having a thoroughly spiritual, even mystical attitude towards sexuality, which turned it into a dogma. Differently, Jung saw his own perspective and that of analytical psychology as the attempt to overcome the one-sidedness of each polar opposite towards a union of opposites. Sexuality and spirituality are pairs of opposites that need each other. In Psychic Energy, 3 years later, originally entitled A Theory of the Libido, he proceeded further in developing his view of Eros. When Jung drew to a close his years of confrontation with the unconscious in the end of the 20s, in the early 30s he continued to develop his views. In a seminar on Christiana Morgan's visions, he referred to the erotic encounter between two people as two perfect demons of whom they are mutually afraid. It is merely a sexual attraction, yet that is divine. Kundalini Yoga seminar in 1932, a number of connections were established between the study of Kundalini and sexuality. As Gaia Domenici anticipated earlier, in the Zarathustra seminar, 1934-1939, in his questionable pathography of Nietzsche, he identified Nietzsche as the person who failed to integrate Eros in his life. Again, in 1936, in Children's Dreams seminar, he reminded his audience again that sexuality is always also a psychical experience. It is somehow symbolic and magic. In parallel, Jung developed his extensive alchemical studies, which were often enriched with erotic symbolism, one above all, the conjunctio, or union of opposites, typically represented as the intercourse between king and queen, or rex and regina. And although alchemical images were not necessarily confined to the erotic sphere, the strongly evocative erotic symbolism directly spoke to Jung's evolving perspective on Eros. And in addition to his alchemical studies, Jung's late writings too contain further references to Eros. Interestingly, in his re-elaboration of Van Lungen's Symbole del Libido, Symbols of Transformation in 1952, he still noted that of all the components of the psyche, Eros is the one with the strongest affective tone. This is added in the later edition of Transformation Symbols of the Libido. A few years later, in 1958, he referred in his little book, Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth, to Eros as a wounded deity, hence the title of my talk, that is getting its own back in every sphere of human activity, including psychology. Finally, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in his conversations with Daniela Jaffe towards the end of his life, Jung also summed up the development of his perspective on Eros by saying that it is a widespread error to imagine I do not see the value of sexuality. So in conclusion, I think there are three main points that I wanted to make today, and they are springboard of future research. The first one is try to debunk the myth of Jung's lack of interest in the theme of sexuality as an overview of the presence of Eros in Jung's works. It traverses the entire span of Jung's psychological works, and I left out the importance of this theme in the Red Book, which is crucial. The second one is we can historically trace and locate a precise evolution in this theme in Jung's works. And the third one is that I think we can identify a common thread in Jung's interpretation of Eros. It's the idea of a reconciliation of sexuality and spirituality. It seems like Jung developed a view of Eros that has to do more with individuation, as he called it, than adaptation, as it would be perceived in the context of, for example, Freudian psychoanalysis. I'll stop here.
So, questions and comments?
I do have a question. First, let me thank you. Sorry. Thanks a lot for this brilliant presentation about Eros. That was fascinating. I was just curious to know if you found any, I don't know, major influence. Well, not influences, but like possible fascinations or other sources that you most relate to this way of Jung's regarding Eros and sexuality, and if you found that, like if you did find any sources, like have you found any major shift, at any point in Jung's life? If you can just give a little bit more of historical context, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaia. Well, one major source was the topic of my PhD, now a book. So Dante and Jung's confrontation with Dante, because Tony, Jung copied two entries from the Purgatorio referring to love, which were very important in his development of the Red Book. Tony Wolff was allowed to note down in Black Book 4 a reference again from Dante about the primal love. So I think the transformation of a focus on sexuality to something more like a cosmogonic Eros happens also through his encounter with Dante. Then there are other sources that are less evident but could be explored. For example, Ludwig Klages, who wrote a great book in 1922 of cosmogonic Eros. From what I know, Klages and Jung are the only ones around that time, at least in the German tradition, to speak of cosmogonic Eros in an attempt to overcome the dichotomy Platonic love and biological or mechanical reductionism around sex, with a different view. But Klages and Jung also have strong differences in many other respects. And then I don't know if we can think of something else. These are two names that popped to my mind. Maybe Sonu can tell us more. I hope that answers to some extent.
It's heretical to get out of this. It's unfair to ask you to get out of your context and go into what's the more common context with historians of science today, but it seems that the philosophy of Foucault and history of sexuality is that in some ways we have to be freed from sexuality to understand sex, or Eros, I think, as Jung would talk. And if you look at what you've told us today about the differences between Freud and Jung, is there was a disagreement about this, that Freud sort of free us of sexuality, the problems of sexuality to enjoy life and productivity. And it seems that Jung was saying almost the same as Foucault, free us from that, so that Eros and that most affective of human experiences can be enjoyed. Am I misinterpreting that, or as I said, is it unfair to ask you to get out of your context and look at the one that's more familiar in history of science today?
I don't know, because I think they're quite different approaches. There might be some point of contact, but I think they're coming from a quite different perspective on this. What I seem to get from Jung is to offer a different view of sublimation with regard to Eros. So to put it in simple terms, to move away from the idea of sublimating Eros to become more civilized and adapted in society, to something more like, no, Eros allows you to transcend the constraints of society. That's why he talks about also the spiritual dimension. It's not the purpose of becoming more civilized, it's about getting in touch with the spirit as well. I think that's pretty radical.
It is.
Just to add to that, in the sense that what, in terms of, in my sense, with Jung's critique of Freud, what Jung is doing is critiquing Freud's conception of infantile psychosexuality. And he's saying, this is not sexuality. Right? So he's in a way trying to save or rescue sexuality from an interpretive framework that is interpreting adult sexuality, depotentiating, as it were, in terms of a replication of infantile psychosexuality. So in a way to recover the phenomena. In a certain sense, there's an odd proximity with Wilhelm Reich, coming from a completely different angle. It's sex that Jung is interested in, not psychosexuality.
Yes.
A question about the difference between men and women. The interpretation of Jung of sex and Eros, is it mostly totally a man-like vision? Is there any interpretation of the world in the mental world of women?
He tried.
What makes you say so, more specifically? Sorry.
In the world of the 20s, that's a man's role. Yes. The difference with the modern world is it is a bisexual, also a women idea of what's Eros and what's life. But is it doomed to be with Jung to be the world of 1900?
Does it work? Yeah, I think that's fair. It does. It's difficult to say. I think in some of the references to Eros that I presented today, the gender problem is overcome. Like he's trying to go beyond that. But in some other respects, I think you're right. It's probably it's coming from his own personal experiences. It's coming from his engagement with women at the time of the Red Bull. So there is a certain bias, perhaps, in that respect. If you look at other
text, like for example the seminar on Christiana Morgan's visions, that is an attempt to give voice much more to the feminine side of Eros, and it's quite a long seminar and detailed. So I don't think the entire Jung is trapped into the historical time where he was developing these views. There are different nuances to that topic, but it's a criticism that, or it's an observation that often pops up with Jung.
And so the interpretation of Jung is doomed.
Is doomed?
Yes, it's lost. It is forgone. It is an old century ago.
I don't know.
Nothing up to the modern times.
I don't think so. Not that I am a defender of Jung at all, but
That's what you are.
I
But what's your subtlety?
was okay. Yeah, no, not really. I'm not Jungian. So I'm not sure. I think actually what I said about a different view of sublimation speaks to men and women regardless. I mean, an individual can like it or not, but it's really a little to do with gender. I think it's seems to me quite timely and thought-provoking, at least. But I don't know what the women think. It's a discussion between them. It seems like, I mean, what comes to my mind as you spoke was the fact that Socrates gives the Ultima. Socrates says, I learn about the things of love from a woman, the Ultima, because I know nothing about it. So there is, I think, a tradition in Western philosophy that Eros is naturally linked to a feminine symbol, at least. And Jung refers to the importance of the Ultima in the Socratic tradition. So I think if we look in detail, we can go beyond simplifications around genders, and there's something quite precious in Jung's contribution. I suggest the seminar on visions, Christiana Morgan.
Could you say more about Jung's interpretation of Beatrice? Repeat.
Beatrice.
Could you say more about Jung's interpretation of Beatrice in the Commedia?
Yeah. Oh. Well, there's a book coming out in August. So Beatrice was seen by Beatrice, the muse.
Tommaso, can you speak into the mic?
Yeah.
So Beatrice, the beloved one of Dante in the Divine Comedy, was seen by Jung as the most beautiful and perfect representation of the encounter with the soul, which he referred back as something starting in the Middle Ages, when worshipping of the woman was for Jung the idea of worshipping of the soul, worshipping of the inner world. So the idea for Jung was that Dante was a spiritual knight who ready to undertake the journey into the unconscious, a journey into the depths to find the lady of the mind, to use a Dantesque expression, which again, it wasn't necessarily feminized as a gender symbol, but it was more about finding the dimension of the inner self. In the Jung's Red Book, this becomes the soul as she. That is the main. It's in the various characters that Jung encounters in the Red Book. The soul as she is the main reference point, is the main dialogue of his I, his ego, versus the inner world. So Beatrice was the great inspiration of the Western discovery of the inner world.
It seems to me that the notion of opening up a discussion on Eros and the history of the human sciences free from monopoly of psychoanalysis would be a good theme for a further ESHHS conference.
Yeah, thank you.
So we now pass back to Arthur, who's had a terrible odyssey after getting to Utrecht. His plane was cancelled. He had to take the bus back to join us on Zoom in Amsterdam.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah?
One second, Arthur.
And make sure the volume is
Of course,
as high
no
as
problem.
possible.
Is your volume as high as possible, Arthur?
Sorry, is my what?
Your volume is as high as possible, or can you make it?
It's as high as possible, but I can speak up if it's,
Yeah, try
if it's
to, yeah.
necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Just so he's speaking.
One sec.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Arthur, you're free to go.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, and everyone can hear me, also in the back of the room?
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's return to a classical psychoanalytic sex theory. The paper that I'm going to give today is a bit of a springboard for future research too. I'm planning a longish essay on the life and work of Nikos Kazantzakis, and this paper, as it were, came out of the preliminary research for that study. And I'd like to apologize again for not being there. I was looking forward to meeting you all in Rome a lot, but as Sonu said, first my plane got cancelled due to a storm, and then the train got cancelled also due to the storm. And I'm very happy to be able to participate in this way, but I apologize for the inconvenience. Also, I'm afraid I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so you're going to have to look at me and my bookshelf for half an hour. But let's begin. So the story starts in Vienna in May 1922, where a young Greek writer is attempting to finish his poem on the life of the Buddha. He's confined to his bedroom, where he's slaving away at the verses, and he's trying to lead the life of an ascetic himself. This youngish man, he's 39 at the time, eats very little, meditates regularly, and at home in Crete, he has a wife, Galatea. He writes to her diligently, updating her on the progress on the book. And he's also very sick. His face is swollen, it's covered in sores. He's unable to eat without a straw. He can't shave, and pus is seeping from his lips, which he soothes using compresses. And the verses on the Buddha are not coming together. For solace, he writes, he is, and I quote, reading the wonderful theory of Freud in regards to instinct and dream, unquote. Nikos Kazantzakis is truly in a miserable state. Many years later, in his autobiography, he will write about this time, I began to provoke my soul, to torment it. Although it desired to become entangled with the flesh and be granted a mouth and hands with which to kiss and touch the world, I stood in its way. For Kazantzakis, this dilemma between the needs of the body and the demands of the soul will become the central axis around which most of his literary works will turn. Consider, for instance, Zorba the Greek, his best-known novel, about a young bookish man who meets his spiritual counterpart, Zorba, an anarchist and a hedonist, a man who lives the life of the body. Or another famous story, The Last Temptation of Christ, where Jesus is forced to choose between an earthly life with Mary Magdalene and a life dedicated to the Spirit, to God. Nikos Kazantzakis' novels and plays can be read as experiments in living, with at the heart of them invariably a choice, soul or body, idealism or materialism. And in all of Kazantzakis' writings, the corporeal is pitched against the spiritual, locked in battle. Trained as a philosopher under Bergson, Kazantzakis' philosophical works are now largely overshadowed by the literary ones. Quips and aphorisms remain, such as, "We come from a dark abyss, we end in a dark abyss, and the luminous interval in between we call life." But even as a literary figure, repeatedly nominated for the Nobel Prize and celebrated by writers such as Albert Camus, he is an acquired taste nowadays. It's not hard to see why. His sentences are long and overcrowded. His allegories dip frequently into romanticism and even cliché. He's perhaps better preserved on the silver screen, a dancing Anthony Quinn as Zorba, a young Willem Dafoe as Christ. Kazantzakis is reportedly Jeff Bridges' favorite author. Largely forgotten then, the dude abides. But as far as I'm concerned, the true gems are his travel books. As a journalist, Kazantzakis not only beautifully chronicled some of the most relevant events of the 20th century, he was in Russia in the early days of the revolution, and he interviewed Mussolini extensively. He also aspired to capture the soul of the places he visited, England, Spain, Japan, to name a few. At this, I would say he largely succeeds. But let us return to Vienna now, to the time when Kazantzakis is still to write all these books, and when he's hungry and tired and ill. He has, by this point, consulted a number of physicians and dermatologists for his mysterious skin disease, with little to no success. And throughout the following months, June, July, and most of August of 1922, he's locked in his room. Even the smallest excursions aggravate his illness. And so he does what many of us would do. He throws himself into his work. But at times, he will recall later, and I quote again, "Despair would step through the bastions of work, and at evening, especially towards dusk, I sometimes found that I could not hold back the tears," unquote. One evening, he's no longer able to bear all this wretchedness, and he decides to go out, to visit an opera. Uncomfortably swathed in bandages, he finds himself approached by a stranger there during the performance's intermission. The older gentleman asks him, somewhat impertinently, "Would you mind telling me what role eroticism plays in your life?" Kazantzakis is taken aback, shocked even, but the stranger hastens to add that the question is purely clinical, scientific in nature. And the stranger goes on to explain that he is a professor of psychology at the university, and that he would look upon it as a favor if Kazantzakis were to visit him in his office the very next morning. Reportedly, the man apologizes one last time and then reveals his name, Dr. Wilhelm Stekel, psychoanalyst. Wilhelm Stekel, born 1868, died 1940, could have stepped out of a novel himself. He was what you might call a contrarian psychoanalyst. In his initial 8-week treatment with Freud, 48 sessions, his complaints centered around impotence and compulsive masturbation. Although he wasn't cured by the treatment, it left him impressed enough to become one of Freud's first and most prominent followers. Stekel's contributions seem to have been of great value to the budding field of psychoanalysis. He served as an editor for its publications, wrote about psychoanalysis as a journalist, and co-initiated the Wednesday Psychological Society, one of the earliest platforms for psychoanalytic thought. And some of Stekel's own ideas, such as the death drive and the role of anxiety in the formation of neuroses, even made it into Freud's later works unacknowledged. Ultimately, however, Stekel ended up on Freud's list of apostates, along better-known rebels such as ʻWhere and Jung. It appears that Stekel had a bit too much imagination, was a bit too obsessed with masturbation, and had too much of a will of his own to become a true Freudian henchman. Freud called him a pig on several occasions. By 1912, Stekel had quit the psychoanalytic movement, but was still doing his own adapted version of psychoanalysis. He was known for brief treatments, active analysis he called it, with one of his guiding principles being to try and cure a patient in as brief a time as possible, and seeking out their mental conflicts actively, in a way that resembles what is now a hallmark of some forms of short-term psychodynamic therapy. Largely unacknowledged, however, Stekel killed himself in London on the 25th of June 1940. After his death, the New York Times published an obituary that read, Dr. Wilhelm Stekel, Viennese psychoanalyst and formerly an assistant to the late Sigmund Freud, was found dead in his hotel room today. His age was 74. He was surrounded by open books and documents, one of which said, I'm passing away like a warrior. Guns and cannons are only temporary. The goodness for which England stands will put right all wrong, unquote. The Times piece is accompanied by a grainy photograph. We see a man with heavy eyebrows, a pointy goatee, and a sloppy tie. And that is roughly what he looked like in 1922, when he picked the young Greek writer out of the crowd. It's important to point out here that the accounts of Kazantzakis' treatment with Stekel differ slightly. As of yet, I've not been able to uncover any references to the meeting between the two men in Stekel's works, so the account here is based solely on Kazantzakis' retelling of the episode, which he did, and did differently on a number of occasions. In his own autobiography, for instance, he condenses the episode into a single session, but from other sources, primarily stemming from his American translator Timon Fryer, we glean a bit more. Fryer interviewed Kazantzakis at length, late in his life, and from those discussions, as well as his letters to Galatea, it appears that Kazantzakis visited Stekel a number of times, probably for a few weeks on end. Stekel was likely the one who gave him Freud's texts on instincts and dreams to read. And if we overlay the different accounts, the narrative of a short but impactful treatment emerges. In Stekel's office the next morning, Kazantzakis finds himself once again answering the curious doctor's questions. He explains to him that he's been fascinated for years now with the Buddhist image of life, and that, here in Vienna, he's trying to capture the essence of that vision in a verse drama about the Buddha, as well as to live by its principles. He's renouncing the senses, eats sparingly, controls his appetites of feeling and sound, and castigates the flesh. To this, Stekel responds, and I quote, "To search in order to find the world's beginning and end is itself a disease. The normal person lives, struggles, experiences joy and sorrow, gets married, has children, and does not waste any time in asking whence, whither, and why. But you didn't finish your story. You're still hiding something from me. Confess everything." Now, whether Kazantzakis truly confessed everything on the spot is, of course, unknown. But at some point, in the course of their talks, he tells Stekel the following story. Soon after arriving in Vienna, Kazantzakis had paid a visit to the theater. And during that visit, he had, in a way similar to his meeting with Stekel, found himself confronted by a stranger. This time, however, the stranger had been a rather beautiful and charming young woman. And he and the woman had struck up a conversation, which was, incidentally, quite an alien thing to do for Kazantzakis, who was, by nature, very shy. And the two had left the play before it ended. The rest of the evening, they wandered romantically around the streets of Vienna, steeped in conversation. And by the end of the night, Kazantzakis found himself inviting this young woman to his room. She, however, told him that she was unable to join him that night, but that she would be delighted to visit him the following night. That evening, Kazantzakis goes to bed elated, but the next morning he finds his lips and chin swollen, and he lets the woman know he won't be able to make their scheduled meeting, and makes an appointment for the night after. Day after day, however, Kazantzakis' skin condition worsens, and day after day he has to postpone the rendezvous until his face is entirely bloated. Now Stekel reportedly listens to this story in amazement, glowing with understanding, Kazantzakis writes, and he exclaims, "But my dear sir, this is extraordinary. Your malady was a rather common one in the Middle Ages, but is most rare in our time. Indeed, in my entire scientific career, I have encountered only one such other case, that of an extremely upright, pious Viennese lady. This lady loved her husband very much, but he was away at the front, and she chanced to meet a young man and fell in love with him. One night, she was ready to surrender herself, but suddenly her soul rose up in revolt, opposing her. Her face became repulsively swollen, just as yours is now. In desperation, she sought me out, and I reassured her. You'll be cured when your husband comes back from the war, I told her. And indeed, as soon as her husband returned, in other words, as soon as the danger of sin was past, her face regained its original beauty. Your case is the same. My dear sir, you are trying to live out of your century. It's not possible to emulate the saints today. I assure you that unless you do not only renounce any possible contact with your lady of the theater, but also leave Vienna itself, your swelling will not recede. Your body is suffering from remorse of the spirit." Now after this interpretation, Kazantzakis finds himself annoyed. He writes, "I had already begun to hate this man, because he was examining my secrets beneath his indiscreet magnifying glass, and struggling to force open all the barred and padlocked doors inside me. But the doctor, undeterred, apparently pushed on. Do you understand now? Plunged as it is into Buddhist Weltanschauung, your soul, or rather what for you goes by the name of soul, believes that sleeping with a woman is a mortal sin. For that reason, it refuses to permit the body to commit this sin. Such souls capable of imposing themselves to such a degree on the flesh, are rare in our age. You will be cured as soon as you depart from Vienna and leave the woman behind you." I didn't believe it, Kazantzakis writes. Scientific fairy tales, I said to myself. I'll stay in Vienna. I'll stay and I'll get better. And even though he continued to visit the psychologist and read the literature that he was given, he found it hard to admit psychosomatic origins of his disease, or even that conflicts of the spirit could, in such a way, deform the flesh. And yet, he also appears to have been captivated by the explanation. Perhaps being compared to a saint suited Kazantzakis. At any rate, he writes to his wife, while conveniently leaving out the etiology of the disease. I quote, "According to this psychologist, my illness is the result of a mental and spiritual disbalance, which manifests itself in the body, something like the wounds of St. Francis. He told me that I have a spiritual and mental energy beyond the normal, and that the body suffers the reaction. I understand those hermits now," he writes, "who were attacked suddenly with leprosy when in their retreat they reached out toward God. Skin diseases were the most usual manifestations." One morning in August, having grown exhausted with the whole business, Kazantzakis gets out of bed with a sudden determination to leave. And he writes, "I took my valise, then descended the stairs, emerged into the street, and headed for the station. It was early morning, and a cool breeze was blowing. Working-class men and women were racing to their jobs in merry flocks, still munching mouthfuls of bread. The sun had not come down in the streets yet. Several windows were being opened. The city was awakening. I walked with weightless steps, in a fine mood. I was awakening just like the city. I felt my face losing its burden as I proceeded. My eyes were freed, they could open now. The swelling in my lips began to subside, and I started whistling like a child. The cool breeze passed over my face like a compassionate hand, like a caress. And when I finally reached the station and took out my pocket mirror to look at myself, what joy, what good fortune. The swelling in my face had entirely disappeared. My former features, nose, mouth, cheeks, had returned. On arriving at his next destination, Berlin, he writes to Galatea, I was made well in a miraculous manner as soon as I left Vienna. And 2 weeks later, fortunately, I'm still healthy. I hope the Viennese psychologist was right, and that this spiritual sickness of mine passed forever as soon as I put some distance between myself and Vienna. If this is so, it will have been a neo-ascetic case of great interest. Some time later again, he tells his wife that he has torn up all his verses on the Buddha, and that he intends to recast the work in an entirely new form. This will become his own spiritual testament, the book later known as The Saviors of God. Stekel's brief therapeutic intervention, for which he was known, helped the Greek writer to find meaning in his suffering. It offered what a psychoanalyst might call an ego-syntonic explanation of his illness, placing the devout patient in a long tradition of suffering ascetics. The episode also provides some insight into Stekel's particular approach to psychotherapy, actively seeking out the mental conflicts underlying a neurosis. Now, as for Kazantzakis, the short treatment pivoted his attention towards the twists and turns of the spirit and the different ways in which they're grafted on the body. From that moment on, he will have the central conflict for his best-known works at hand, the ongoing struggle between soul and body. In these future plays and novels, he will explore what happens when we commit ourselves existentially on either side of this body-soul divide. And if we're to believe Kimon Fryer, Kazantzakis' translator, the writer only experienced brief episodes of his mysterious illness later on in life, usually during the summer months. That is my fault.
Questions, comments?
I'm sorry, but on the surface it seems like the most traditional conservative Christian allegory. If you take yourself away from temptation, all will be right in the world. But I thought we could expect something better from psychoanalysis.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because a large part of what we know of this treatment was written in a period in Kazantzakis' life later on, when he'd returned to his Christian upbringing.
Right.
And where he's very concerned with recasting his whole life, as it were, back in a Christian light. So, for all we know, the treatment was slightly different. But in his sort of retelling of the story, après coup, as it were, it gets a kind of Christian slant.
Yeah, thank you, Arthur. And on that note, I was wondering, how can you go from the life of the Buddha to the saviors of God? It sounds like the least Buddhist thing you could possibly say. Maybe you could say a bit more.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because he was... Kazantzakis, basically, he's trying on all these religious and ideological cloaks throughout his life. Right, and we meet him at the time when he was very much interested in Buddhism. But this is very much the tail end of his interest in the Buddha. And he, actually, when he leaves Vienna and travels to Berlin, he will meet a group of women there, some of which he has an affair with, actually, who will convert him to Marxism. So he goes from thinking of himself as a Buddhist through this psychoanalytic episode to Marxism. So it's interesting that there's that kind of, again, that sort of idealism and materialism divide there, and that, you know, that psychoanalysis is, as it were, the conduit through which he goes to Marxism, and it will be a kind of spiritualized Marxism. So it's not a real materialism that he adopts, but yeah, as you say, it's, you know, he's trying out these different ideological cloaks, as it were, and that's where we find him, in the middle of one of those transformations.
Is there anybody else? Otherwise, I was going to ask a bit more. So, you know, there's something that Jung says that I very much disagree with, that is about going back to your spiritual church might have a very healing effect. It seems like Jung would have been quite happy about this case, and to interpret it in those lenses. I mean, that's just a thought, rather than a question mark.
Yeah, that's nice. Well, he goes back to Christianity, but he has a very interesting conception of God, right? He says that, towards the end of his life, he says, God has for a long time saved us, and now it's our time to save God. So it's he has this kind of psychological conception of God. You know, we need an idea of God to structure ourselves, to sort of give us a moral framework to work within. But it is true that he returns to religion at the end of his life.
Could you say more about Stekel's short-term analysis, in terms of, you indicated how he tries to directly confront a problem. What sort of duration was he aiming for, and are there any conduits to later kind of forms of therapy along these lines?
To be honest, Sonu, I don't know very much about it. Not enough yet. What I've read is that he was that his aim was to treat as fast as possible, and that you know, he saw it as a victory or as a success if he treated someone as quickly as possible. Which of course is in contradistinction to sort of classical psychoanalysis, and it also made him, it was also a way of, I think, as I understand it, for him to set himself apart from the sort of classical psychoanalytic tradition. Yeah, that's all I can say at this point.
So, ironically, in terms of outcome studies in psychoanalysis today, the IPA might do no worse than going back to Stekel and taking a leaf out of his book to legitimate itself.
Yeah, well, I've heard that, or I read that a lot of that sort of he wasn't really, so that a lot of sort of contemporary theorists of short-term psychodynamic therapy have kind of returned to Stekel, but that there wasn't much interest at the time.
Okay, great. So. Just to mention what Arthur's presented today is like a sort of, you could say, a chamber piece. His own thesis was like in the musical terms, like a whole symphony in terms of on the rise and fall of psychohistory, which I think would be of interest to everyone at ESHHS. I'm still waiting for it to come out as a book. I actually want all my graduate students to publish before I die. But I thank you for your presentation. And I thank the organisers and everyone here for permitting our travels to the affected virtual session and your attention. Thanks. Time for some coffee and some chocolate and cigarettes and other addictions. They're not Steckelian masturbation. Thanks.